Welcome back. It's time now for The World This Week. Now, you may be surprised to know we're not going to be talking about the French presidential elections, round one of which is on Sunday. Not because there is a shortage of things to say, but because French electoral law prevents us from doing so. Instead, we're going to be focused on the main events in Ukraine these past 7 days. We'll also be talking about Turkey's decision to transfer the trial of those suspected of killing the journalist Jamal Khashoggi back to Saudi Arabia. We'll also be looking at the uptake in violence in Israel. Plus, we'll be talking about the historic vote for Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first black woman ever nominated to the US Supreme Court. Lots to talk about, and here to discuss that, I'm joined in the studio by Celestine Bolan, who is an independent journalist and former New York Times Moscow correspondent. Very warm welcome to you. I'm also here in the studio with journalist and documentary filmmaker Paul Moreira. Thank you for coming to see us. From New York, we're joined by the Daily Beast's deputy world editor, Noor Ibrahim. Very nice to have you with us. So that's our panel today. And we will begin in Ukraine, where the Russian invasion has now entered its 7th week. Well, the week began with shock and outrage across the globe at the horrific images of what the invading Russian forces had left behind them in the town of Bucha. And now the week comes to an end with more horrific images. Dozens of people, many of them women and children, killed in rocket attacks on a train station in Kramatorsk in the east of Ukraine. Well, this attack came at a time when the station was packed with civilians who were trying to evacuate. Let me start by asking you, Celestine, you know Russia well.
Yeah.
Russia's reaction to those events in Kramatorsk, Russia's reaction to what happened in Bucha has been pretty much the same as on lots of other occasions. It wasn't us. How do they think that's believable to the rest of the world?
I mean, it's implausible denial. I mean, because all the evidence is there. I think obviously the biggest audience for them is their own, who Russians are following the war. If those who can get on their VPNs and get onto various YouTube channels and Telegram channels. But for many, many, many people, it's just not even a story, apparently. You know, people say you go to kiosks and it's hard to find even a newspaper because as somebody said, if you're not going to write the news, then why even come out with the paper? I mean, I'm not quite sure what that's about. Maybe there's some shortages, which also is going on in the economy. But the fact is, I think it's an ability to tune out something you don't want to know. And not that you believe what the government is saying, but that you just think it's not coming to your doorstep. So they're taking care of it. They're keeping it away from you. And that's all people want to know. I think, in terms of the international opinion, I think it's a complete flop when they try to do. Particularly this thing this week with the Russian embassy in France putting out tweets which are sort of sarcastic, saying that's all a mise en scène. It's like a film shoot in the places where they found the bodies. I mean, there's something so deeply cynical and really creepy about that, which I think they realized because they then had to take it down.
Yeah, and it's not the first time we've heard that sort of narrative, is it? I mean, you understand and you know the Russia propaganda machine well as well, Paul. I mean, it sort of sounds a lot like a lot of the narrative surrounding atrocities in Syria as well. I mean, they're using this same confuse and muddle the world to the extent that perhaps they'll scare us off and we'll lose interest.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the interior aspect of the story is very important because they have to convince their own opinion. But I've been watching closely the social networks, and one guy has been very active. Is kind of known now. Evgeny Prigozhin is the master of the Wagner commandos, but he's also heading a network of propaganda. kind of news agencies like South France and Anna News, and they have been broadcasting on the social networks their own propaganda, and it's directed not only to the Russians but also I think to us, even though they cannot pass through Twitter because they have been banned, but you can see them on Telegram and all that. So yes, they have been deploying as much as they can, because the war now, and I think it's the first time in history, is waged in the context of open source intelligence working incessantly, and you basically have the information in the minutes after the events, because you have satellite photos and you have all those guys like Bellingcat type of investigators that cross the data and stuff, and it's impossible. I mean, sustaining a lie today is something really difficult because there are so many ways to cross data. So it's really the challenge for the Russian propaganda is how do you apply a 20th century propaganda machine to a 21st century environment, and of course they will lose on that, except on the national market because they're pretty strong on that.
Let's speak to Noor in New York. I just want to get your take on this, because there was a moment of realism this week from the Kremlin when they acknowledged the mounting losses, which they described as a massive tragedy. So clearly the human cost, plus the enormous economic cost that's been inflicted on Russia, it must be far beyond anything that President Putin could ever have imagined at the outset.
Of course. I mean, it's impossible to deny at this point. They spent weeks and weeks reporting very, very minimal casualty numbers. I think the latest announcement they made was 1,300 Russian troops have been killed in action. The real number is much, much greater than that, and we all know that. So it was definitely interesting to see. I wouldn't call it honesty yet because, they haven't touched on specific figures. They haven't been reporting that to the Russian people at all. But just that acknowledgement of, framing it as a huge tragedy and saying there is significant loss is definitely notable. But at the same time, I also feel like it could be part of another strategy on their part. What that strategy is, I don't know, but obviously Putin and his cronies and delegation have no problem lying on the world stage. So I guess we'll see.
One of the other big developments in the course of the week has been happening in this evening, Friday, the visit to Kyiv by the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and the EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell. They've been talking to the Ukrainian president, a big show of solidarity with their visit, and they've been reassuring their hosts about eventual membership of the European Union. I gather we can listen to a clip of Ursula von der Leyen speaking there in Kiev earlier on.
We are with you as you dream of Europe. Dear Volodymyr, my message today is very clear. Ukraine belongs to the European family. We've heard your request loud and clear. And today we're here to give you a first positive answer. In this envelope, dear Volodymyr, there is an important step towards EU membership.
Ursula von der Leyen speaking in Kiev a little earlier on Friday. Well, let's bring in our Brussels correspondent, Dave Keating, who joins us now as well. Dave, just tell us what the significance of this visit to Kyiv is, in your opinion, and what those two leaders set out to achieve by making that visit by train to Kyiv this Friday.
Well, it's quite symbolically significant because, of course, the two leaders are putting themselves at risk by traveling to Kyiv. It's nowhere near the amount of risk that there was, say, a month ago because, of course, Russia has retreated away and is now focusing on the east. But, of course, Ukraine is still a country at war, and traveling across that country by train involves a certain element of risk. So it is definitely a high-profile show of support. And also, Ursula von der Leyen can speak on behalf of the EU, unlike the three prime ministers who went last month from Slovenia, Czech Republic, and Poland. Now, when she's saying there that she has a very clear message, The message is actually not very clear, because what she's saying is Ukraine is part of the European family. Well, that could mean anything. That could mean a kind of outer tier outside of the EU, but inside the free trade area, something, this kind of two-tier Europe that has been suggested by French President Emmanuel Macron, or it could mean full EU membership. It's not actually very clear, and the reason it can't be more clear is because EU countries are split on this subject. Not everybody thinks that Ukraine's place is in the European Union, ever. A lot of people think that perhaps expanding to the Ukraine would be a step too far geographically and to a country too large. It's a lot of the same concerns that have been present for Turkey, and so that a better route would be a kind of outer tier where Ukraine is within the EU single market for some things, not for other things. There's lots of different opinions about this, and it will take years to work this out. She's pointing to one step in the process, and that is that the Commission is giving a kind of initial recommendation about whether talks can start to go toward accession talks. It is an extremely preliminary step. But of course, people want to show their solidarity to Ukraine, and there's lots of leaders in the EU that are desperately asking for this to be sped up. There's no prospect of it being sped up, but I think she wants to highlight that first step at least, because at least it is something, and they want to give people in Ukraine something to hope for the future, when they think when this is all over, that they could have a stable, peaceful European future in the EU, or as some other people have suggested, kind of adjacent to the EU, in it for some things, not in it for other things.
Symbolic visit, as you say, to Kyiv by those two top senior officials from Brussels. Celestine, you wanted to say something?
I mean, I just wanted to say that, actually, the waiting room for Europe is actually quite crowded already. I mean, we're not talking about Turkey because that's really not going to happen. But we've got North Macedonia that's been sitting there waiting to get in. It changed its name in the hopes that that would do the trick. It didn't do the trick. And there's Albania that's now linked to North Macedonia. So, I mean, at the end of the day, and that's okay, I think. I mean, frankly, I think that the membership of the family is the message that she wanted to give, and that's received. I mean, the bureaucracies of getting into the union is one thing. And then the other thing I just wanted to say is, Ukraine as part of Europe is a red flag for Vladimir Putin. Actually, it was not just the issue of NATO membership and everything. It was back in 2013 when Ukraine was trying to join an association agreement, which wasn't even the waiting room. It's like, the door outside. And that for Russia is just what's not acceptable. They cannot see this country go outside of its sphere and into the West, which is Europe. So, I mean, I think it's interesting how important that is, and it doesn't really matter where the kind of actual boundary is. It's Ukraine wants to be part of the West.
Sure. Yeah, and Russia doesn't want that to happen. One of the other notable revelations this week has been on the subject of time frame. We heard from the Kremlin this Friday, today, saying its aims are being achieved. Russian operations could end in the foreseeable future, they said. But earlier in the week, we heard the NATO Secretary General saying the fighting could last for months or even years. Your thoughts, which is it?
Well, one thing is really clear is that the special operations goal was to do regime change with I think taking Kiev was part of was on the map, and they didn't realize that it was impossible, so they're retreating. They probably, but that's a wild guess because no one knows what's in Putin's head. But they probably now try to secure as much territory along the Black Sea coast as they can, and definitely Donbass. They will try to secure as much as they can from their point of view. And Mariupol, they will probably take. And my guess is that they will stop there and they will try to, colonize or whatever you want to call it, those areas, because the rest of any plan is totally out of any kind of rationality for them.
Noor, what are your thoughts with regards to perhaps how this could all end? I mean, is there a face-saving solution that could be found that might be acceptable to the Russians, that might bring this to an end sooner rather than later?
You know, I'm not too sure. I mean, it's difficult to, like I said, it's difficult to take anything that Putin says at face value. And, you know, obviously the talks, the peace talks this week were really hampered by just the horror that we've been seeing in Ukraine. It's difficult to conduct good faith negotiations and believe anything that they're saying when every day there's a new massacre, not just in the places that they're retreating from, but like you said, in eastern Ukraine, just today, dozens of civilians killed. So it's difficult to see those images coming out and simultaneously try to take what they're saying seriously. And the more you see that, the more it erodes at what little trust exists between delegations of both countries. So it's really difficult to say.
Thanks for that, Noor. Let's move on now to our next topic. There's so much to say about Ukraine, but let's move on to Turkey, because this week the country announced that it's transferring to Saudi Arabia the trial of those accused of having had a role in the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. Well, Khashoggi's killing at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul back in 2018 sparked international outrage. Well, Turkey's decision has raised fears that those responsible for the killing of the Washington Post columnist might never face justice for their crimes. Well, that's certainly the fear of Khashoggi's fiancée. Listen to what she said.
Turkey halted the legal process with this decision and transferred the trial to Saudi Arabia. We know very well how the justice system works, or rather doesn't work, in Saudi Arabia. Of course, nobody expects a positive decision or justice to prevail. I don't expect it either. This is a political decision. The decision that is given at the court today is purely a political one.
Okay, the fiancé of Jamal Khashoggi speaking there, expressing no hope for justice. I mean, it doesn't look like justice is going to be delivered if that court's being transferred back to Saudi.
No, of course not. I mean, they already tried in some ways the 5 men whom they never even identified. And no sooner did they convict them than they reduced their sentences to some time in prison. So, I mean, that there be justice in Saudi Arabia is not possible. The issue is, why is Turkey doing this? And we know that Saudi had asked them to do it. It seems like a pretty high price with not a lot of return for them, but clearly Turkey wants to make, peace isn't the word, but get on better with Saudi Arabia. And this is the money that got put on the table, I think.
Yeah, and I must say that Turkey also has a bad record when you talk about killing people on foreign land, because, I mean, just in France, you had those 3 ladies from the PKK, the Kurdish militants that were killed in Paris. And to my knowledge, there was no political pay for that. I mean, they didn't have to either go in any kind of international trial or any kind of So I think that for me it was even a surprise that Turkey was so involved in starting the investigation on Khashoggi's case, because basically, I mean, they've been doing almost the same with the guys from the Ministry of Interior, paying grey wolves in Europe to do undercover operations and sometimes killings.
Sure. So a little bit of the pot calling the kettle black in this particular case. Dave, I want to ask your opinion. I mean, rights groups are calling this decision by Turkey scandalous, transferring that trial back to Riyadh. Why do you think they're doing this?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that justice won't be served if the trial goes to Saudi Arabia. I don't think anyone is under any illusion about that. It does seem to me that this is probably for diplomatic reasons, that they're trying to... It seems to me that the Turkish government wants to put this case behind them. They want this to be kind of forgotten about. And I think from the perspective of the West, you're looking at 2 governments which are not highly trusted in either sense. And so you're kind of looking at them. You don't want them to have a perfectly close relationship, but at the same time, you wouldn't want them having a really bad relationship either. But I think this just furthers human rights concerns, frankly, in both Turkey and Saudi Arabia, because, of course, the Saudi Arabian government is the one accused of carrying out this killing. And Turkey now is also under a cloud over this whole affair because they now seem to be trying to cover it up and not to be in the interest of justice being done for a crime that was committed on their territory in Turkey.
Yeah, Noor, let's bring you back into the conversation. We heard from the lawyer of Jamal Khashoggi's fiancé saying, let's not entrust the lamb to the wolf. Let's protect the honour and the dignity of the Turkish nation. How do you think Turkish people feel about this? A trial being sort of swept aside in the hope that perhaps it will make the economy a bit better, because the Turkish economy, as we all know, is in dire straits.
You know, I think obviously there's a difference between what the government wants and what the people want. I think, you know, it's obvious that the Turkish government here has prioritized their own interest in terms of building a better relationship with Saudi Arabia and putting that above the judicial process. And I wouldn't be surprised if people, maybe not openly, but privately, talk about how embarrassing this is. Really, I think it's shameful because I think it chips away at Turkey's soft power. Not that, you know, there weren't human rights issues there before, but this was just such a highly publicized case. And let's be real here. This marks the end of the case. This decision effectively squashes any hope that justice will be served at the end. Why? Because we all know who ordered that assassination, and he would like nothing more than for it to go away. And what better way to do that than to have it take place in Saudi Arabia? So I agree. I think it's a scandal, and if it wasn't so horrible, it would be almost comical in a way that this is being permitted. So I just think it's sad, really.
Yeah, it's been 4 years since, nearly 4 years since Jamal Khashoggi was killed there in Istanbul. At the time, the US intelligence community pointed the finger of blame pretty squarely at the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. Do you think, Celestine, that MBS, as we call him, has managed to successfully sort of rehabilitate his image internationally?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, you know, it's 4 years, but it's not that long ago, actually. And I think that story, gruesome as it was, horrific, you know, poignant, sad, with his going into the embassy to get his papers to get married. I mean, you know, every aspect of let's not talk about the chainsaw. I mean, that went in and was used to dismember the body. It will not go away. However, we see that everybody has relations with Saudi Arabia, nonetheless. I mean, everybody. I mean, including the United States, including France, including Russia, including, you know, other than Iran. It's pretty hard to find anybody that doesn't sort of put this under the rug, diplomatically speaking, but not in terms of public opinion. I don't think so.
And what about in Saudi itself? I mean, what do we think about Mohammed bin Salman's reputation, his standing there? I mean, he's clearly feared, and speaking out against him has pretty dangerous consequences, doesn't it?
Obviously, I think he's someone not to be joking with. But I think that the key of the way Turkey behaved is that there's a chessboard in the region, which is Syria, and during the conflict, the revolution, the turmoil, etc. The Saudi Arabia has been a very active player. Turkey has been a very active player too, because they have annexed part of the northern Syrian territory. So it's also two big players on the area, and I don't think Turkey has any interest for human rights record that is difficult to clean up on just one case, to abide by the law and do what they should do morally and legally, which is follow the investigation on Khashoggi's death.
Yeah, and Noor, I just want to ask you before we move on. I mean, this sets a pretty unfortunate precedent, doesn't it, for other countries, other leaders to commit assassinations on foreign soil and get away with it.
Absolutely, and I think that it also shines light on leaders, including U.S. President Joe Biden, who said that, before he was elected, he said he was going to show the world what a pariah MBS is. And, beyond that report, which pretty much just confirmed what we already knew, there hasn't been that much accountability. And I'm afraid that he's just going to continue to go to get away with it without anyone holding him to account.
Okay, and Dave, let me just ask you lastly, I mean, do you see this story just disappearing off the news radar?
I don't. Well, I don't think this works entirely to make people forget that this happened. If that's the intention of moving the trial over to Saudi Arabia and just kind of sweep this under the rug, I don't think that works. The name Khashoggi will always ring in people's ears when thinking about both Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And like I said before, I think what this does is basically tarnish Turkey with the same brush. When people think about this whole incident, they're going to have a negative connotation both of Saudi Arabia and of Turkey.
Okay, thanks for that, Dave. You've had the last word on that particular story. Let's move on, because on Thursday evening, Israel witnessed its fourth deadly attack in the space of 3 weeks. At least 2 people were killed when a Palestinian man opened fire. Sorry, that number's been increased to 3 people killed when a man opened fire on a crowded bar in Tel Aviv. Well, following on from a massive manhunt, the 28-year-old gunman was tracked down earlier on Friday and killed in an exchange of fire. Well, Thursday's attack brings to 14 the number of Israelis to have been killed since the 22nd of March, making this one of the worst waves of violence in recent years. Noor, let me ask you first up. What do you think is behind this period of heightened tensions?
I feel like this really, obviously any loss of civilian life is just absolutely horrible, but I think it raises the question of, has Israel been a little too focused on Iran, a little too focused on building other relationships in the Middle East, as opposed to focusing on the Palestinian issue at hand, which has been sidelined for a while now. I think this is definitely a result of just the delay in addressing the occupation, Palestinian sovereignty, and I think that we can expect to continue to see this kind of violence pop up unless it's dealt with accordingly.
Yes, Celestine, we haven't talked about the peace process for as long as I can remember. It feels like everyone's forgotten. Do you agree with what was just said? And do you think perhaps, we're going to see more of these attacks to try to bring that issue back to the fore?
I honestly don't know. And looking at the story of these 3 or 4 different attacks, it's hard to see where the links are, to what extent it's coordinated. One of them was by Arab Israelis who were then claimed that they were acting on behalf, or somebody claimed that they were backing Islamic State. Then there are others that are strictly Palestinian sort of oriented. It's also been pointed out that this is a period that when Passover, Ramadan, and Easter all come together, so there's a kind of the mix of religion and passions and what. So I honestly don't know. And again, I think that's probably the question everybody in Israel is asking: is this just the beginning of something, or is this 3 flashes in a pan? The killings are brutal. People just walking up in the middle of the street and shooting people dead. It's not.
And it used to be knives, and now it seems to be more guns.
That's right. So again, I think I'm sure there are experts out there who can decipher some of this in terms of whether there's linkage or not.
Yeah, it's very strange because it was not claimed by anybody, not by the Islamic State, not by Hamas. Hamas hailed it, but didn't say they organized anything. But I think what Noor said is true. Any type of peace process has stalled for more than 10 years now, and basically the way Israel tries to remain totally motionless on any type of negotiations with the Palestinians and trying to have the situation evolve into something more easy to live for the Palestinians of the territories. I'm not speaking about the Israeli Arabs, of course, that have a pretty normal life, but the Palestinians in the territories live a very, very difficult life, more and more strangled. It's a pretty Kafkaian type of life for them. So this has to find a solution somehow, and it cannot be brushed under the rug for 10 years again, because that will, of course, trigger more violence on the Palestinian side, obviously.
And Dave, what do you think? Why do you think this issue of sort of peace and dialogue has so disappeared from the radar? Because we heard today President Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authorities, condemning what happened in Tel Aviv on Thursday, although it has to be said that Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon did not condemn it. But Mahmoud Abbas, he cuts a pretty lonely figure nowadays, and he seems to have been somewhat abandoned, and his cause seems to have been entirely abandoned by the international community. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that Israel's neglect of the Palestinian situation, of neglect of working toward a solution, obviously has been going on a while and predates the Ukraine war. However, I think that what we can see is, this would be a very, very big story and a very alarming story in normal times. And yet, because of the Ukraine war, it's kind of pushed off of the front page, if you will. And I think we're going to see increasingly more of that, especially these long-running conflicts, as we now look at this kind of major acute crisis that we're all looking at. Some of these other conflicts are going to be not only left off the news agenda, but also left off the diplomatic agenda. Because, of course, when you're looking at all of these different hotspots and conflicts that are ongoing throughout the world, there's only a certain amount of diplomatic capital and diplomatic space that major countries can involve themselves in. And I think even for Israel, of course, this neglect has been happening for a while, but they've also kind of inserted themselves as in an earlier attempt to be a neutral arbiter in the Ukraine conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And I think it's a case of there's only so much capital, there's only so many people, so many resources that you have to devote to diplomacy. And the more things get focused to Ukraine, the more that some of these long-running conflicts are going to move off the agenda.
Sure, and in Israel itself, interesting to see the reaction and people saying, the government's got to do more. They've got to come down harder and crack down on these types of extremists. And I'm just wondering whether that's clearly going to fuel yet more violence, isn't it, Noor?
Absolutely. It'll continue to do so until the underlying issue is addressed. And that's what we've been seeing for years now. I don't think this is a problem that can be solved with just more, just clamping down, more forces, more aggression. That's just going to fuel more violence. And I think, again, it just comes back to that issue of addressing the underlying problem, which is Palestinian sovereignty, the occupation that has been going on for so long. We've seen this story on repeat for years, and I think it's time to just realize that reality and prioritize it.
Sure, and in Israel itself, the Prime Minister is looking pretty fragile. Naftali Bennett lost a lawmaker on Wednesday. I'm just wondering, do we think his position is looking tenable at this stage? Do you think Naftali Bennett's days could be numbered?
I don't really know about Israeli politics, so I'll pass on that question. Sorry.
You're going to pass on that one. Any opinion? Any thoughts as to who might be waiting in the wings? For example, Benjamin Netanyahu watching all of this as an opposition figure now, and he's perhaps thinking of a comeback?
Yeah, I mean, Netanyahu is always hovering over the Israeli politics, but I think he suffered, some problems with those accusations of corruption and all that. No, I think that in terms of internal options, there are very few. Basically, Israel has been drifting towards conservatism and Likud type of governments for many, many years now, and I don't see like a enlightened political man that could, do what the great Israeli leaders who have, done the history of this country have done, which is speaking peace with the Palestinians. So for now, it kind of looks a bit obscure for me.
Okay, and Dave, just lastly with you on this topic before we move on, do you think Benjamin Netanyahu is waiting in the wings and just waiting for his moment to make some sort of a comeback?
I'm sure, and this, of course, has been the speculation since he was removed from office. Of course, he's not done. He doesn't think he's done, and I think that he will be ready to spring in. I think the rest of the world, particularly certain countries that have had a difficult relationship with Netanyahu, would not be eager to see that take place.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Dave Keating in Brussels. Let's move on because Thursday's confirmation of Ketanji Brown Jackson to the US Supreme Court marked an undeniable success for the Biden administration. With an approval rating of about 41%, and only a few months to go until the midterms, the president was in dire need of some political uplift. Well, this appointment, placing a black woman on the nation's highest court for the first time ever, fulfills one of Biden's key campaign pledges. Well, let's listen to what the US President Joe Biden said a little earlier.
There are moments that people go back in history and they're literally historic, consequential, fundamental shifts in American policy. We all saw the kind of justice she'll be: fair and impartial, thoughtful, careful, precise, brilliant, a brilliant legal mind with deep knowledge of the law.
The US president there, flanked by Ketanji Brown Jackson and the Vice President Kamala Harris. Well, let's listen to what Ketanji Brown Jackson said about her nomination.
It has taken 232 years and 115 prior appointments for a black woman to be selected to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. But we've made it. I strongly believe that this is a moment in which all Americans can take great pride.
Okay, Ketanji Brown Jackson speaking on the lawn of the White House, standing next to the president. Noor, I'd like to ask your opinion. I mean, we've heard historic as the label attached to this nomination. That's no exaggeration, is it?
Not at all. I mean, it is historic. She's black, she's a woman, she's younger. And besides all of those points, she's someone who's very accomplished and qualified. I think that, it's definitely a historic moment. It's probably worth keeping in mind, though, that, the confirmation process was nothing short of grueling. I think you had some congressmen just flat out walk out of her confirmation hearing, which I think is very sad because I just feel like you can't deny that this is a huge step forward. At the end of the day, it does, even with her confirmation, it is still a very conservative court. But I think we should, take a moment to definitely have some pride in this because it was a long time coming, and it's worth celebrating, I believe.
I mean, I agree, and I think, she said it's a moment for all Americans. Unfortunately, the process, as you described, the nomination process, was not only grueling, it was kind of indecent. People just rounding on her because, among other things, she had been a public defender a key part of any legal system, and certainly in the American one, and that they took her to task because she had defended criminals, as if this is somehow a stamp, tars her memory, her reputation. And it has to be said that the Senate Minority Leader McConnell literally turned his back and walked out of the chamber at the moment when everybody was standing and applauding. And so, yes, all Americans, that would be nice, and it would have been great. And I think that there were some politicians who made sure that really wasn't the thing that came away from this nomination process.
Yeah, and of course, replacing Justice Stephen Breyer doesn't actually change that 6-3 conservative liberal ideological balance at all, does it? So it doesn't change anything as far as what comes out of the court is concerned, but it's hugely symbolic, isn't it?
Well, it's now 4 women and two Black Americans, 1 Latina. So from the symbolic sense, that's great. But I think, as you say, 6-3 is what we've got in terms of the conservatives versus the liberals. So,
from the other side of the Atlantic, it's just it's more a distant perception. But I was very moved. I didn't hear the little speech she gave when she. And you can almost hear the tears in her throat. And to a lesser extent, it's a bit the same emotion that when Obama got elected, it was, wow, a black man, and now she's a black lady at the Supreme Court. It's very moving. I mean, you can feel that even though, you have racism, you have all that you described that is pretty shocking, still something, history is walking, and it's great to see that happening, a black woman at the Supreme Court.
Yeah, hundreds of years
Yes.
in the making. Dave, I mean, this is a lift for President Biden. How much of a lift? And is it enough of a lift, given that we've got the midterms coming up in just a few months from now?
I'm not sure it is much of a lift. I mean, this is a historic moment and people can feel good about that. But me as an American watching this from the other side of the Atlantic, I did not feel good about this process. I mean, those confirmation hearings, they were more than grueling. They were a disgrace. You had Republican senators, let's just call it for what it is. They were lying about her. This was an eminently qualified nominee. They were just throwing everything at her and seeing what would stick, but it was completely fact-free. They were tarring her with the most revolting accusations that were not based in any truth. And this is where American politics has come to. And I think anybody who was paying attention to these hearings can't come away from this feeling very good about their country, no matter how historic this appointment is, and no matter how much it represents a real milestone for America. The confirmation hearing, I think, is more reflective of where America is right now. And that's not going to give people a good feeling even about Biden or about the whole situation. And I think it's going to discourage a lot of people from even wanting to participate in the democratic process.
Sure. Well, we're almost out of time. I'd just like to give Noor, who's in New York, the last word on this nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson, given that you are geographically closest to where these events have been taking place. Your final thoughts on this highly respected judge taking up that position.
Yeah, I mean, there's truth to everything that's being said in terms of the confirmation process and the show that took place. I think that there's other problems on the horizon, too. Republican leaders are refusing to commit to not blocking Biden from choosing another, from nominating another court justice, and that's and that would be horrible, especially if the Republicans regain control of the Senate in the fall. So I think there's a lot of hurdles along the way with that. But I still think that it's worth taking pride in that moment while acknowledging the embarrassing acts that took place this week at the same time. And I'll leave it with that.
All right, Noor Ibrahim, you've had the last word. Thank you very much indeed. That's it for this edition of The World This Week. I'd like to thank our guests here in the studio. Celestine Boland, thank you very much to you. Thank you to Paul Moreira. Thank you so much. And thank you to our correspondent, Dave Keating in Brussels. Just before we go, let's head back to where we began, which was Ukraine, because the British band Pink Floyd has just released its first new track in 30 years. It's a song entitled Hey, Hey, Rise Up. And the idea is that it will raise money for the people of Ukraine. We're going to leave you with a clip of that song. Thank you so much for watching. Do stay tuned to France 24.